I want to start by reading from the McCue paper. During the 1948 review, parents and leaders pointed to the poor quality of education program in these institutions and the lack of professional teaching qualifications of the teaching staffs in both residential and day schools. Many parents and leaders believe that First Nation students were receiving an inferior education in comparison to provincial students attending provincial schools. The federal government agreed, and during the 1950s, under a banner of integration, it set about to correct the imbalance in both the education curriculum and the qualifications of teachers. Residential schools were eventually phased out. The provincial education curriculum was introduced to reserve schools, and provincially certified teachers were recruited. Yippee! Residential schools were phased out, and now teachers must be qualified to teach First Nation students. Almost 70 years later, the feds are still telling us what qualified means. The feds are still telling us that we have to follow Ontario curriculum if we want to continue to receive funds from them to run our schools. So if we were to look at schools off the reserve, this is what it would look like overall. So at the Ministry of Education level is where the policymakers would be. This is also where curriculum writers would be. It's where textbooks get approved. It's where the qualifications for teachers are decided. It's where classroom size is completed by staff for research, analysis, stats, and administration. Then there's the Board of Education. They implement the policies that are made at the Ministry of Education, and they provide assistance to teachers. Under them is the School Council. These serve the students, teachers, parents, and school administrators. And under them, everyone kind of sits at the same level. That's where the public school board is, the parents that volunteer at the school, and also the provincial teacher federations. So to give you an idea of what we have, and by we, I mean First Nations, I'll talk about the levels when compared to the pictures and the levels I just showed you. So I like to think of myself as pretty informed in terms of band council and the issues around education. Anything I'm curious about, I text my cousin, who's the chief of Six Nations, and ask her, and she just tells me flat out. So, at the national level, First Nations education has the following. So, the National Indian Education Council, NIEC, and like I said, I like to think I'm pretty informed about education. This is the first time reading McCue's paper that I've ever heard of this organization. So they are appointed by the AFN, which is the Assembly of First Nations. The council sounds great, so I Googled them. I found a couple of videos, which also sound great, and you can watch those videos. I'll put them over there. Hopefully you'll watch them. The first video, A Better Future for Our Children, speaks to the idea of funding for education, so you can watch it there. The second video speaks to the lack of funds and policy surrounding post-secondary education. There's never enough money. I'm quite sure that those settlers who made the treaties with my people many moons ago had no idea that we would not go away and would continue to demand our treaty rights to be honored. So I kind of got off track there a bit, sorry. So getting back to the National Indian Education Council, the NIEC, McCue's paper clearly states that funding is the biggest barrier about the National Indian Education Council. He says its mandate is limited by its lack of money and jurisdiction. I've already talked about money, and we all know that it's the root of all evil, and there's never enough money, so let me remind you of something about the jurisdiction and the AFN. What you have to keep in mind is the AFN is an advocacy organization representing First Nations in Canada. This does not mean they represent First Nations. They are merely there to advocate for all First Nations across Canada. This is to say that we do not all agree with what they advocate for. Remember Sean Atleo's resignation as the national chief? That leads to the AFN's Chief Committee on Education. People holding these positions are 2 to 3 staff, depending on the funding, whose mandate is limited by funding. Furthermore, this committee lacks funding and jurisdiction. What they mostly do is lobby INAC, Indian Affairs, on education topics and issues. I feel like I'm saying funding and lack thereof a lot in these sections. So, that's the national level. What would be comparable to the Ministry of Education level, I suppose. Next is the provincial level. As McCue points out, There is limited funding from INAC to maintain anything even remotely close to what's going on with non-Indigenous schools. At the regional level, we do have a director of federal schools. She's not from our community and actually travels from about 3 hours away. I guess this part is what would be comparable to the Board of Education and school council levels in provincial government. Our Board of Education is our director, who's not from our community, and her administrative assistant. We don't have school councils. All of the teachers who work at my school must be members of the Ontario College of Teachers, so we do have provincial teacher federations. We do not have a public school board. Well, actually, I guess we do. This would be the Director of Education again. Anything we need or do, we go to her. She's a very busy woman. As far as parent volunteers go, we have some dedicated parents who come out to home and school meetings every month at my school. They're held on Wednesdays, and there's probably about maybe 5 people who come out every month. In the McCue article, this is one of my most favorite statements that I highlighted. The bottom line is that First Nations, like the federal government, have relied too long on the province to educate their children. First Nations have decided that it is time to reclaim the right that every other person in Ontario has, and that it is the right to educate their children by means they choose, to achieve the education goals they decide. I think we decided this a long time ago. It's just getting the right people to understand this. I'm going to talk about the option that McCue discusses in the section, What are the ways to create a First Nations education system and curriculum? I like the idea of option 2. I've said it before in other responses. Just because there are Indigenous people in Ontario, it does not mean we are all the same. We have different languages, different leadership, decision making, all of that. So we cannot be lumped into one group and given a blanket to fix everything. And this is why it's so important that each nation is heard. I love the idea of having curriculum that matches individual nations. It validates all Indigenous people and their ways of knowing and being. It says we matter, and that's why we're learning about it. Educational infrastructure is huge. This must be powered by First Nations and must include authority, fiscal, and professional resources to deliver quality education. I love all of the suggestions and got very excited as I was reading what he had offered. I was especially excited over a couple of points: defining and enforcing teacher qualifications. I kind of been on a rampage about what qualified means, and special education programming policies. Since I'm doing my final policy around spec ed, this one is especially significant to me. I've had a lot of difficulty finding any research around special needs and Indigenous students. I've asked a number of people, including a retired teacher who worked the better part of her career with the special needs students on our reserve. I asked her if there were any articles and if she could point me in the direction of a researcher, a scholar, or anyone that has done any research in this area. Her response was, "When you find some, can you let me know?" I like the idea of delivering a curriculum that is based on Indigenous philosophy, and not just a blanket one-size-fits-all philosophy. It would be one that's developed by individual nations to suit the needs of those students attending. This semester, I took Class 810, Integrated Planning, Instruction, and Assessment, where we learned all about curriculum conceptions and educational philosophies. All I could think about while I was reading those articles, besides trying to stay awake, was, how am I ever going to apply this at my school? Then I thought about my students and started to question if they felt the same way about the things I've taught them. I quickly realized that, yes, they're absolutely bored. They were as bored as I was, because I've actually had to wake up a few students. I had to shake them because they were asleep at their desks. Not cool when they're in grade 6. So let's talk about funding. McCue points out that to support the educational infrastructure he describes, there will need to be a lot more money. One needs to remember that this is not new money, because it's money that was promised to my people decades ago with the promise of education until the sun shines, the river flows, and the grass grows. My reserve is currently in talks with the feds to take over control of education. There are so many issues with this, the biggest one being funding. There will never be enough money. The fear is that once the band is given control over education, the money stops. There will never be enough money. McCue says that when an amount can be agreed upon, that's when the negotiations between First Nations and the feds will begin. What is most important is the amount of funding needs to be appropriate to develop, implement, and sustain First Nations education. Self-government and Aboriginal education are very closely related. I think they're one and the same. For decades, Indigenous communities have been trying to take control of their education. I feel like the movement, or lack thereof, by the feds to allow Indigenous communities to take over their education system mirrors the fight for self-government.